Welcome, dear friends. After a tiring and stressful day, welcome to another journey into the depths of the mysterious and inexplicable. I am so happy that you have chosen to spend this quiet time with us in Mystic Sleep Tales, where we explore the shadows of history, the whispers of forgotten stories, and the mysteries hidden in the gaps between what we know and what we wonder about. Tonight, we journey to a place of profound beauty and ancient power, to a moment when the old world and the new world meet face to face, when sacred bells ring in a city caught between centuries, and something impossible leaves its mark on those who witness it. Relax, let the tensions of the day fly away, and let's return with me to Kyoto in the spring of 1895, to a story silently passed down through generations, whispered in temple courtyards, and written in diaries few have read. This is the story of the moment when the temple bells rang alone. Part 1. The Awakening City. Spring arrives differently in Kyoto than anywhere else in Japan. It doesn't simply appear one day, announced by a sudden warming or a single burst of blossoms. Instead, it unfolds slowly, deliberately, like a scroll being carefully unrolled to reveal an ancient painting. In the spring of 1895, this unfolding carried particular significance, for Kyoto itself was emerging from a long winter of uncertainty into what many hoped would be a glorious renaissance. The city had been Japan's imperial capital for over 1,000 years, from 794 until 1869, when Emperor Meiji moved the seat of government to Edo, which was renamed Tokyo, the eastern capital. For Kyoto, this loss had been devastating, not merely politically but spiritually and economically. Suddenly, the city that had been the heart of Japanese culture for a millennium found itself relegated to the status of a provincial capital. The population had declined sharply. Wealthy merchants and noble families had followed the emperor eastward. The grand mansions that had once housed courtiers and ministers stood empty, their gardens growing wild, their walls crumbling. But by 1895, something was stirring in Kyoto, a renewed sense of purpose, a determination to reclaim its place in the nation's heart, if not as a political center, then as the keeper of Japan's soul, the guardian of its traditions, the living museum of its most profound cultural achievements. The year marked the 1100th anniversary of the city's founding as Heian, the capital of peace and tranquility, and civic leaders had decided this milestone would be celebrated in a manner befitting Kyoto's illustrious history. The centerpiece of these celebrations was to be the construction of a new shrine, the Heian Jingu, a magnificent structure that would commemorate the first and last emperors to reign from Kyoto, Emperor Kanmu and Emperor Komeei. The shrine would be built in the architectural style of the ancient Heian Palace, though at 5/8 scale, a conscious echo of past glories rendered in brilliant vermilion and white, visible for miles across the city. The ground would eventually encompass elaborate gardens designed by the master landscape architect Ogawa Jihei, spaces where water, stone, and living plants would create scenes of such beauty that visitors would feel transported to the Heian period itself. But in early 1895, as the shrine was still under construction and the city prepared for the grand opening planned for March 15th, Kyoto existed in a state of beautiful tension. Everywhere, old and new jostled against each other. Electric tram lines, powered by hydroelectricity from the recently completed Lake Biwa Canal, ran through streets where merchants still sold their wares from wooden stalls unchanged in design for centuries. Men in Western-style suits and bowler hats walked past women in traditional kimono, the latter experiencing a revival in popularity after an earlier rush toward Western fashion. The city was modernizing, yes, but it was doing so while clutching tightly to its identity, determined not to lose itself in the headlong rush toward Westernization that characterized so much of Meiji-era Japan. It was into this atmosphere, charged with anticipation, nostalgia, and an undercurrent of anxiety about what modernization might cost, that our story begins. The setting is not the grand new Heian shrine, but rather an older, smaller temple in the Higashiyama district, nestled into the eastern hills that shelter Kyoto from harsh winds and provide the city with some of its most breathtaking views. This temple, which we shall call Shorinji, though that is not its true name, had stood on its hillside site for nearly 400 years, through wars and fires, earthquakes, and political upheavals. Shorinji was a Zen Buddhist temple of the Rinzai school, modest in size but possessed a particular quality that drew visitors, a sense of deep tranquility that seemed to emanate from the very stones of its buildings, from the ancient pine trees that surrounded the main hall, from the small but exquisitely maintained garden where moss grew thick on water-smooth stones. The temple was home to 7 monks, led by an abbot named Koyu, a man of 70 years whose lined face and gentle manner spoke of decades spent in meditation and study. But this story does not center on the abbot, not primarily. Instead, it focuses on a younger man named Takashi, who served as the temple's lay custodian and guardian. At 32 years old, Takashi occupied a unique position in the temple hierarchy. He was not a monk, had never taken vows, but he lived on the temple grounds in a small residence near the main gate, and his life was dedicated entirely to the temple's maintenance and protection. His father had held this position before him, and his grandfather before that, stretching back through generations to the temple's founding. Takashi was a quiet man, thoughtful and observant, qualities that serve him well in his role. Each morning, he rose before dawn to sweep the temple pathways, clean the stone water basins, ensure that the offerings of flowers before the main Buddha were fresh, and attend to 100 other small tasks that kept the temple functioning smoothly. He knew every flagstone of the path, every branch of every tree, every subtle change in the garden as the seasons turned. The temple was not merely his workplace. It was his world, and he moved through it with the unconscious grace of someone navigating their own home in darkness. Among Takashi's many responsibilities, one stood out as particularly sacred: the care of the temple's great bell, the bancho that hung in its wooden bell tower, or shoro, at the highest point of the temple grounds. This bell was ancient, cast in the early years of the Edo period, and it bore inscriptions that detailed the names of the donors who had funded its creation, along with prayers for peace and protection. The bell was enormous, nearly 6 feet tall and weighing well over a ton, cast in bronze that had acquired over the centuries a patina of deepest green-black that seemed to absorb light rather than reflect it. Every evening at the hour of the boar, what we would call 10 o'clock in the evening, Takashi would climb the wooden stairs to the bell tower and ring the bell 108 times, the traditional number representing the 108 earthly desires or banno that, according to Buddhist teaching, must be overcome on the path to enlightenment. The sound of the bell was remarkable, a deep, resonant tone that began with the impact of the wooden striking beam against the bell surface, but then seemed to swell, filling the air with layer upon layer of harmonics, creating a sonic texture so rich and complex that it was less like a sound and more like a physical presence, something you felt in your chest and bones as much as heard with your ears. The bell's voice carried far beyond the temple grounds, flowing down the hillside and into the city below, where it was one of dozens of temple bells that marked the passage of evening hours. For the residents of the neighborhoods nearest Shorinji, the bell was a beloved and comforting presence, a nightly reminder of continuity and tradition, a sound that their parents and grandparents had heard, that connected them to centuries of people who had lived and died in this place. On the evening of March 8th, 1895, 7 days before the grand opening of the Heian Shrine, Takashi completed his daily round of duties and began preparing for the evening bell ringing. The weather had been unseasonably warm for early March, and the first cherry blossoms had already begun to open on the temple's handful of sakura trees, delicate pink petals like small prayers hanging in the still air. As twilight deepened, Takashi lit his oil lantern and made his way up the stairs to the bell tower. The ritual never varied. First, he would pause at the threshold of the bell tower and perform a small bow toward the bell, a gesture of respect for this object that served as a link between the human world and the realm of the sacred. Then he would step inside, hang his lantern on its hook, and check the striking beam, a massive log suspended by ropes that had to be pulled back and released to make contact with the bell's surface. Everything was as it should be. The ropes were sound, the beam balanced correctly, the bell itself serene in its perfection. Takashi took his position, grasped the rope, and began the first pull. The beam swung back, then forward, striking the bell with that distinctive deep tone that seemed less produced by the bell and more like something the bell was releasing, a sound that had been held within the bronze for 300 years, waiting for this moment to be set free. 1. He counted silently, letting the tone fade before pulling again. 2, 3, 4. The rhythm was meditative, each strike requiring full attention, full presence. 20, 40, 60. The sound washed over him and flowed out into the growing darkness. When he reached 108, Takashi released the rope and stood for a moment in the silence that followed the final tones fading. This was always a sacred moment, a pause between the completion of one duty and the resumption of others. But tonight, something felt different. The air in the bell tower seemed somehow heavier, charged with an energy he couldn't quite identify. He told himself it was his imagination, perhaps the excitement of the coming shrine dedication affecting his perception. Still, he found himself reluctant to leave the tower, standing there in the glow of his lantern, studying the bell's ancient surface as if seeing it for the first time. Eventually, he collected his lantern and descended the stairs, but the feeling stayed with him, a subtle unease that he couldn't explain and couldn't quite dismiss. He made his way to his residence, prepared a simple evening meal, and tried to settle into his usual routine of reading before sleep. The book before him was a collection of Zen poetry, but tonight the words wouldn't settle in his mind. They kept slipping away, replaced by that lingering sense of something just slightly wrong, like the first symptoms of an illness not yet manifest. Around midnight, Takashi was jolted from an uneasy half-sleep by a sound that sent ice through his veins. The temple bell was ringing, not the measured, deliberate tolling of the evening ritual, but a rapid, irregular clanging, as if someone or something was striking it over and over with desperate urgency. He sat bolt upright, heart hammering, his mind racing. Who would dare ring the bell at this hour? The temple gates were locked. No one should be on the grounds except the sleeping monks and himself. He grabbed his lantern, lit it with fumbling hands, and rushed out into the night. The bell continued its clamorous ringing as he ran up the path toward the bell tower, his feet knowing the way even in darkness. But as he rounded the final turn and the tower came into view, illuminated by a thin slice of moonlight, he stopped so abruptly that he nearly fell. The bell tower was empty. He could see clearly that there was no one inside. Yet the bell continued to ring, its massive bronze form swaying slightly with each impact, the striking beam moving of its own accord, pulling back and swinging forward, back and forward, with no visible hand guiding it. Takashi stood frozen, watching this impossible sight, feeling his rational mind struggle to process what his eyes were showing him. The sound was enormous at this distance, each peal like a physical blow, and in the intervals between strikes he thought he could hear something else, a sound like voices, perhaps, or the wind, or something for which there was no name. Then, as abruptly as it had begun, the ringing stopped. The striking beam swung one final time, made contact with the bell, producing that deep, reverberating tone, and then fell still. The echo of that last strike flowed out across the hillside and faded into silence. Takashi stood in the darkness, his lantern trembling in his grip, and listened to the furious beating of his own heart. Somewhere in the temple complex behind him, he heard doors sliding open, voices calling out questions. The monks had been wakened. Of course they had. Anyone within a mile must have heard that terrible, urgent ringing. Takashi forced his feet to move, climbing the stairs to the bell tower, half expecting to find someone hiding there, playing some incomprehensible prank. But the tower was empty. The ropes hung straight and still. The bell's surface bore no mark of damage, no sign that it had just been struck perhaps 50 times in as many seconds. Everything looked exactly as it should, exactly as it had looked when he left it hours earlier. Yet he had seen the bell ring itself. There was no question of that. He had watched the beam move, had seen the bell sway, had heard the clanging that had shattered the night's peace. By the time he descended from the tower, the other monks had gathered at its base, Abbot Koyu among them, looking far older in the flickering lamplight, his sleeping robe hastily thrown on. "Takashi," the abbot said, his voice steady but concerned, "what has happened?" Takashi opened his mouth to answer, but found he couldn't quite form the words. How does one explain the impossible? Finally, he said simply, "The bell rang, Abbot," but there was no one in the tower. No one at all. The monks exchanged glances. One of them, a younger man named Daichi, said, "Surely you must have been mistaken. Perhaps you were still half asleep, dreaming." But there was no conviction in his voice. They had all heard the bell. Whatever had happened, it had not been a dream. Abbot Koyu studied Takashi's face in the lamplight, then looked up at the dark bulk of the bell tower. "The hour is late," he said finally, "and we will understand nothing more tonight. Let us return to our rest. In the morning, we will examine the bell and the tower carefully. Perhaps there is some explanation we have not yet considered." But as they dispersed, each returning to their quarters, Takashi saw in the abbot's eyes the same fear he himself felt. The knowledge that something had entered their peaceful world, something that obeyed no natural law, something that had announced its presence with the voice of the temple's most sacred object. Sleep would not come easily to any of them that night, and in the darkness, each lay awake, listening for a sound they both dreaded and expected to hear. The great bell, ringing alone in the empty tower. Part 2. the sacred bells of history. To understand what was happening at Shorinji, we must first understand the profound significance of temple bells in Japanese spiritual and cultural life. The Bonsho, these massive bronze instruments hung in their wooden towers, are far more than simple time-keeping devices or calls to prayer. They are, in the deepest sense, liminal objects existing at the boundary between the material and spiritual realms. Their voice is capable of reaching across that boundary in both directions. The tradition of Buddhist temple bells came to Japan from China, where bronze bell casting had been refined over millennia. The earliest Japanese temple bells date to the 7th century, shortly after Buddhism's official introduction to the archipelago. But the Japanese did not merely adopt Chinese bell-making techniques. They transformed them, developing distinctive forms and casting methods that produced bells with unique tonal qualities. A properly cast Japanese temple bell produces not just a fundamental tone, but an intricate web of overtones and harmonics, creating that characteristic deep, complex sound that seems to expand and evolve in the moments after the bell is struck. The bells themselves were treated as sacred objects from the moment of their creation. The casting of a bell was accompanied by elaborate rituals. Sprigs of hallowed mulberry, offerings of gold, and papers inscribed with Buddhist prayers would be thrown into the crucible of molten bronze before it was poured into the mold. The casting had to be done in a single, continuous pour, with no interruption, no hesitation. The bronze, an alloy of copper and tin in precisely calculated proportions, had to reach exactly the right temperature, neither too hot nor too cold. The mold, made from clay and other materials, had to be perfect in every dimension, because once cast, a bell could not be modified or repaired. It either succeeded or had to be melted down and the process begun again. The success rate for bell casting, even among master craftsmen, was only about 50%. Many bells, despite all the skill and care invested in their creation, would emerge from the mold with fatal flaws, cracks in the bronze, or tonal imperfections that rendered them unsuitable for temple use. When a bell was successfully cast, it was considered a minor miracle, proof of the favor of the Buddhas and the spiritual purity of all involved in its creation. The bell would then be left to cure for approximately 2 years, exposed to the elements, allowing the metal to settle and stabilize, before it was finally hung in its tower and consecrated with prayers and offerings. Once installed, a temple bell became the voice of that temple, its sonic signature, unique and irreplaceable. The pitch of the bell, the specific pattern of its harmonics, the way the sound built and faded, all of this was determined by subtle variations in the bell's shape, thickness, and composition, variations so precise that a difference of a single hertz in the fundamental frequency could require the bell to be recast entirely. Master bellcasters spent lifetimes learning to predict how a bell would sound based on its physical properties. But even they acknowledged that there was something mysterious in the process, something that could not be fully controlled or understood. The bells were designed to be heard at great distances. A large bonsho could carry its voice more than 20 miles on a clear day, flowing over hills and through valleys, creating what amounted to a sonic landscape that connected temples to their surrounding communities. For the people who lived within earshot of a temple bell, its voice became woven into the fabric of their daily lives, marking the hours, announcing ceremonies, signaling important events. Children grew up hearing a particular bell, came to recognize its voice as surely as they recognized their parents' voices, and carried that sound with them throughout their lives, as an auditory symbol of home and belonging. But the bell's significance went far deeper than timekeeping or community cohesion. In Buddhist teaching, sound has special power to affect both the physical and spiritual realms. The voice of a temple bell was believed to reach not only living listeners but also the departed, those spirits dwelling in the Buddhist conception of the afterlife. When the bell rang, it was understood to be calling to these spirits, offering them comfort, guidance, and the opportunity to hear the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, even in their non-corporeal state. This belief was particularly emphasized during the Bon Festival, when the spirits of ancestors were thought to return to visit their living relatives. Special bells called Okubo Ogain, great hollow bells, would be hung over wells, and their ringing was believed to send vibrations down into the earth, into the realm of the dead, summoning the spirits upward into the world of light and life. At the festival's end, another type of bell, the Okurikane or sending back bell, will be rung to help guide the spirits back to their proper realm, ensuring they did not linger and become confused or malevolent presences. The most famous use of temple bells, however, was the New Year's Eve ceremony called Joya no Kane, the Midnight Bell. This tradition, which would eventually be introduced to Japanese Buddhist temples of all sects, began in Zen temples during the Kamakura period, when practices from Chinese Chan Buddhism were being actively imported and adapted. The bells would be rung 108 times, beginning just before midnight and continuing into the first moments of the new year. Each of the 108 strikes represented one of the earthly desires or afflictions that cloud human consciousness and prevent enlightenment. The number 108 has deep significance in Buddhist numerology. It derived from the multiplication of the 6 sense organs: eyes, ears, nose, tongue, body, and mind, by 3 possible types of experience: pleasant, unpleasant, and neutral, yielding 18 possibilities. These 18 are then understood as existing in either a pure or impure state, giving 36. Finally, these 36 are multiplied across past, present, and future, arriving at 108. Thus, the 108 rings of the bell on New Year's Eve represent a comprehensive accounting of all the ways human consciousness can be entangled with desire and delusion, and the sound of the bell striking away each of these entanglements is understood as a form of spiritual purification, clearing away the accumulated karmic debris of the year just ended and allowing practitioners to enter the new year with minds made clean and clear. The physical experience of being near a temple bell when it struck is profound and somewhat unsettling. The sound is so deep and so loud that it becomes tactile. You feel it in your chest, in your bones, in your teeth. The air itself seems to vibrate, to become momentarily denser and more charged. Some people report feeling emotional responses to the sound that they can't fully explain, a sudden welling of sadness or joy or longing that seems to come from nowhere, or perhaps from everywhere, as if the bell's voice is reaching something in them that exists below conscious thought, below language, in that realm where emotion and memory blur together. This physical and emotional impact is not accidental. It is built into the bell's very design. The shape of the bell, with its sloped shoulders and flat striking surface, is said to resemble the seated posture of the Buddha in meditation, and this resemblance is taken seriously. Before striking the bell, one performs 3 bows, exactly as one would bow before a statue of the Buddha, acknowledging the bell as a sacred object deserving of reverence. The strike itself should be firm but not violent, executed with mindfulness and respect, as one is not merely making noise, but participating in a ritual act that connects human, bell, and cosmos in a single moment of sound. There are countless stories in Japanese history and folklore of temple bells manifesting supernatural properties or serving as focal points for inexplicable events. One of the most famous is the legend of the bell at Dojoji Temple, the subject of a famous no play and numerous kabuki adaptations. In this story, a woman named Kyohan falls desperately in love with a young monk named Anshin, but he rejects her advances and flees to Dojoji, where the other monks hide him inside the temple's great bell, hoping to protect him from her wrath. Kyohan, however, is not deterred. Transformed by her rage and despair into a serpent, she pursues Anshin to the temple, discovers his hiding place, and coils herself around the bell, breathing fire onto it until the metal grows red hot and the monk inside is roasted alive. This gruesome tale has been interpreted in many ways, as a warning about the dangers of desire, as a tragedy of communication failure, as an exploration of the power of transformation, both physical and spiritual. But at its heart is the bell, serving as both sanctuary and prison, both protection and doom. The bell in the story is not merely an object, but a character in its own right, participating in the drama, its form and substance essential to the narrative's terrible conclusion. Another famous bell story comes from Midera Temple, involving the legendary warrior monk Benkei. According to the tale, Benkei once stole the temple's enormous bell and attempted to drag it up a mountain to his own temple. The bell, however, refused to ring once removed from its proper home at Midera, no matter how hard Benkei struck it. Frustrated and realizing the futility of keeping a bell that would not sound, Benkei rolled it back down a mountain, where it shattered into pieces upon impact. The bell, the story suggests, was not merely a physical object, but possessed something like consciousness or loyalty to its temple that persisted even when the bell was taken by force. These stories reflect a deep-seated belief that temple bells are not entirely of this world, that they possess a quality that transcends their material nature. This belief was reinforced by the actual experiences people had with bells, experiences that seemed to confirm that something inexplicable was happening. There were documented cases of bells ringing at moments of historical significance, without anyone striking them, as if responding to events in the human or spiritual realm. There were bells that people claimed would ring when an important person was about to die, serving as heralds of transition from life to death. There were bells that were said to heal the sick when their sound washed over those suffering from various ailments. During the Second World War, Japan faced a critical shortage of metal for military purposes, and the government issued orders requiring temples and shrines to surrender their bells to be melted down and recast as weapons and ammunition. This requisitioning of bells was a source of profound grief and trauma for countless communities. The bells were not mere property, but spiritual anchors, objects that embodied centuries of prayer, tradition, and communal identity. When the bells were taken away, people lined the roads to watch them go, weeping openly, and many temples held Buddhist memorial services for their bells, treating them not as objects being destroyed, but as beings dying, worthy of the same rituals accorded to deceased humans. Approximately 45,000 temple bells were destroyed during this period, representing about 90% of all the Bansho in Japan. In some cases, Temples replaced their bells with taiko drums, wooden percussion instruments that could mark time but could never replicate the bell's profound acoustic presence or spiritual resonance. When the war ended, one of the first priorities for many temples was to commission new bells, to restore that lost voice, though the new bells, however beautifully cast, could never fully replace those that had been destroyed. The lost bells had been individuals, each with its own voice, its own history, its own relationship with generations of listeners. The new bells were starting over, creating new relationships, new histories, and it would take decades, perhaps centuries, for them to accumulate the spiritual weight of their predecessors. All of this, the history, the ritual, the stories, the beliefs, form the context in which Takashi and the monks of Shorinji had to understand the impossible thing that had happened on that March night. Their bell, a bell that had hung in its tower for nearly 3 centuries, a bell that had rung through wars and earthquakes, through the fall of the shogunate and the restoration of the emperor, through the opening of Japan to the West and the transformation of traditional society. This bell had rung itself. It had moved without being moved, had spoken without being spoken through, had violated every natural law, while fulfilling its spiritual purpose of creating sound that reached across the boundary between worlds. What message was it sending? What spirit or force had caused it to ring? And most troublingly of all, would it happen again? These questions haunted Takashi as dawn broke over Kyoto on that 9th day of March, the light revealing a temple that looked exactly as it always had. While something essential had shifted, some invisible barrier had been breached, and the normal order of things could no longer be trusted to hold. Part 3. The Mystery Deepens. The morning after the first inexplicable ringing brought no answers, only more questions and a pervasive sense of unease that seemed to have settled over the temple grounds like an invisible fog. Takashi had slept perhaps an hour, his rest fractured by vivid dreams in which the bell rang continuously, its voice distorted into something that was no longer quite a sound but rather a feeling, a vibration that resonated not in his ears, but in his bones, in his heart, in some part of him that had no name. He rose with the first light, earlier than usual, driven by a need to see the bell tower in daylight, to confirm in the clear light of morning that it was still just a structure, just bronze and wood and rope, nothing more. The walk up the path to the tower felt different somehow, as if the very stones beneath his feet had subtly changed their character overnight. Everything looked the same, the moss on the water basin, the way light filtered through the pine branches, the arrangement of raked gravel in the small garden near the monks' quarters, yet it all felt displaced by a hair's breadth from normalcy. The bell tower stood silent and solid, and Takashi found himself reluctant to approach it, a feeling he had never experienced in all his years as temple custodian. This was absurd, he told himself. It was just a bell tower, just wood and metal. There was nothing to fear. Yet his feet seemed to disagree with this rational assessment, and he had to force himself forward step by step until he stood at the base of the tower's stairs. From below, everything appeared normal. The tower's roof was intact, no signs of disturbance or damage. The walls, open on all sides to allow the bell's voice to carry unimpeded, showed no evidence of anyone having climbed them or forced entry. Takashi climbed the stairs slowly, testing each step as if expecting it to give way, though he knew these stairs intimately and knew they were solid. At the top, he paused and looked into the tower's interior. The morning light, streaming in from the east, illuminated the bell's surface, highlighting the green-black patina, the subtle curves of its form, the ancient inscriptions that he had read 100 times but could never quite commit to memory. The striking beam hung in perfect balance, the ropes arranged exactly as they should be. There was absolutely nothing out of place. Yet standing there, Takashi felt a prickling sensation on the back of his neck, as if he were being watched, though he knew himself to be alone. He approached the bell and, on impulse, reached out to place his palm flat against its cool surface. The metal was cold, far colder than the ambient morning temperature warranted, and for a moment, Takashi could have sworn he felt something through that contact, a faint vibration, as if some echo of the previous night's ringing still resonated within the bronze itself, too subtle to be heard but present nonetheless. He pulled his hand back quickly, disturbed by this sensation in ways he couldn't articulate. Behind him, he heard footsteps on the stairs and turned to find Abbot Q ascending, moving slowly, using a walking stick he rarely needed. The old man's face was drawn, his eyes showing the same lack of sleep that Takashi felt in his own body. "I thought I would find you here," the abbot said, his voice quiet. "You cannot stay away either." Takashi bowed. "I needed to see it in daylight, abbot. To make sure." "To make sure of what? That it is still only a bell?" Koyo stepped into the tower and regarded the bell with an expression Takashi couldn't quite read, something between reverence and wariness. "I have been the abbot of this temple for 43 years, Takashi. I have stood in this tower thousands of times. I have heard this bell ring at least that many times. I have cleaned it, repaired the ropes, maintained the striking beam. I know this bell as well as I know any physical object in this world. And yet, standing here now, it feels like something I am meeting for the first time." They stood together in silence for several minutes, both of them studying the bell as if it might suddenly reveal some hidden message, some explanation for the impossible. Finally, Koyu said, "We will watch the tower tonight. All 7 of us monks, and you as well. We will take turns, 2 at a time, throughout the night. If the bell rings again, there will be witnesses, and we will know with certainty that what you saw was not the product of exhaustion or imagination." Takashi nodded, though part of him wanted to protest, to insist that they should leave the bell alone, that watching it somehow felt dangerous, like staring too long into a dark pool and inviting something to stare back. But these thoughts were foolish, products of superstition and fear. They were Buddhist practitioners. They did not flee from mystery, but investigated it with clear minds and careful observation. That was the path they had chosen. The day passed with agonizing slowness. Takashi went through his usual duties, but everything felt mechanical, performed by rote while his mind circled endlessly around the question of the bell. He found himself approaching it several times throughout the day, always stopping at a distance, observing it from the bottom of the tower stairs, as if afraid to get too close, to somehow trigger another inexplicable ringing by his proximity. Other members of the temple community noticed the change in atmosphere. The old woman who delivered fresh vegetables 3 times a week commented that the temple felt different, though she couldn't say how. A student who came for calligraphy lessons told his teacher, one of the younger monks, that the temple felt heavy today, and the monk, who would normally have dismissed such a comment as youthful fancy, found himself unable to do so, because he felt it too. Word the previous night's event had spread beyond the temple walls despite the monk's intention to keep it private. Kyoto was a city of gossip and rumor, particularly in these weeks leading up to the Heian shrine dedication, when the city was more alive with visitors and excitement than it had been in decades. By midday, several neighbors had come to the temple gate to ask about the strange bell ringing they had heard in the night. Had there been an emergency? Was everything all right? Takashi and the monks offered vague assurances, saying only that there had been a misunderstanding, a mistake in the evening routine, nothing to concern themselves with. But the neighbors left unsatisfied, sensing evasion in these answers, and the rumors only multiplied. By evening, stories were circulating in the nearby neighborhoods that ghosts had been seen at Shorinji, that the temple was haunted, that something terrible was going to happen. As night fell, the 8 men, the 7 monks and Takashi, gathered in the abbot's quarters to discuss their watch protocol. They would work in pairs, each pair taking a 2-hour watch from a position just outside the bell tower, close enough to see clearly if anyone or anything approached, but far enough away not to disturb whatever might occur. They would maintain silence during their watches, focusing all their attention on observation. If anything unusual happened, they would wake the others immediately. Abbot Koyu and the eldest of the other monks, a man named Genti, took the first watch, beginning at the hour of the rat, around 11 in the evening. Takashi returned to his residence, but found sleep impossible. He lay on his futon, staring at the ceiling, listening to every sound the night offered, the wind in the pines, the distant barking of a dog, the occasional creak of what's settling in the cooling air. Time seemed to have slowed to a crawl. The first watch passed without incident. The second watch, taken by 2 middle-aged monks named Ryujin and Shokiai, was similarly uneventful. It was during the third watch, in the deepest hours of the night, that something changed. Takashi was on this watch, paired with the young monk Daichi. They sat on a stone bench about 30 feet from the bell tower, wrapped in heavy robes against the night's chill, their eyes fixed on the dark bulk of the tower silhouetted against the sky, just beginning to lighten with the approach of dawn. Takashi was beginning to think that perhaps the previous night had been an isolated event, some freakish combination of factors that would never repeat, when he felt rather than heard a change in the air. It was as if the temperature had suddenly dropped 10 degrees, though that wasn't quite right. It was more like the quality of the air had changed, becoming thicker, denser, charged with some invisible energy that made the hair on his arms stand up beneath his robe. Beside him, Daichi drew in a sharp breath, and Takashi knew the younger man felt it too. They exchanged a glance, and in the dim light, Takashi saw his own fear reflected in Daichi's eyes. Then they heard it, not the bell, not yet, but something else, a sound that was not quite sound, more like a vibration at the very edge of perception, a humming or singing that seemed to come from everywhere and nowhere, from the ground beneath them and the air around them, and perhaps from inside their own heads. The bell tower, which had been merely a dark shape against the sky, now seemed somehow to glow, though there was no visible light source. It was as if the wooden structure itself was radiating a faint luminescence, pale and ghostly. Takashi gripped Daichi's arm, partly to steady the young monk and partly to steady himself, and they watched as the impossible unfolded before them. The bell began to ring, not with the violent, chaotic clanging of 2 nights before, but slowly, deliberately, each strike clear and distinct, resonating with that profound depth of tone that characterized the bell at its best. But there was no one in the tower. They could see clearly that the tower was empty. Yet the striking beam was moving, pulling back and swinging forward with perfect rhythm, striking the bell's surface, producing those deep, reverberating peals that flowed out across the hillside and into the sleeping city below. 1, 2, 3. Takashi counted silently, holding his breath, his heart hammering so hard he thought it might burst from his chest. 10, 20, 30. The ringing continued, and now Takashi became aware of something else, something even more impossible than the self-ringing bell. In the air around the bell tower, or perhaps within the sound itself, there were shapes, or not quite shapes, suggestions of forms, presences that his eyes insisted were there while his mind insisted were not. Figures that might have been human once, or might never have been human at all, gathered around the tower, as if listening to the bell, as if they had been called by its voice and were responding to that call. The striking beam stopped at 108, the traditional number, and the last tone rolled out into the night and slowly faded. In the silence that followed, Takashi realized he could hear Daichi beside him, breathing in short, panicked gasps, and he realized he was doing the same, as if they had both been running though neither had moved. The strange luminescence around the bell tower faded. The sense of presence, of watching figures, dissolved like morning mist under the sun. Takashi wanted to move, to go wake the others as they had agreed, but his legs wouldn't respond. He sat frozen on the stone bench, every muscle locked, staring at the now silent, now ordinary bell tower, trying to process what he had just witnessed. Beside him, Daichi began to shake, not from cold but from the aftermath of overwhelming fear, and that small movement broke whatever spell had held Takashi immobile. "Come," he managed to say, his voice hoarse. "We must wake the abbot." They stumbled to the abbot's quarters and knocked on the door, and when Koyu appeared, pulling his robe around him, Takashi said simply, "It happened again, abbot. And this time we both saw it. We both saw everything." Within minutes, all 8 men were gathered in the meditation hall, sitting in a circle, lamps lit against the darkness that still held dominion over the hour before dawn. Takashi and Daichi, taking turns, sometimes interrupting each other in their eagerness to ensure every detail was conveyed, described what they had witnessed. The other monks listened in silence, their faces betraying a mixture of fear, wonder, and profound disquiet. When Takashi and Daichi finished, Abbot Koyu sat for a long moment in silence, his eyes closed, his hands folded in his lap. Finally, he opened his eyes and looked around the circle at each man in turn. "What we are dealing with," he said slowly, "is beyond the ordinary realm of experience. This is not a matter of misperception or tricks of imagination. 2 of our number, both of sound mind and reliable character, have now witnessed the bell ringing itself, and they have seen or sensed presences around the tower, spirits perhaps, drawn by the bell's voice." He paused, gathering his thoughts. In the sutras, it is written that sound can reach across the boundaries between realms. The sound of the Dharma, the teachings of the Buddha, can be heard not only by the living but by all beings in all states of existence. Our bells have always been understood as instruments that facilitate this crossing, that allow the Dharma to reach beyond the purely physical world. What we are witnessing may be an affirmation of this teaching, a manifestation of the bell fulfilling its true purpose. Ryujin, one of the older monks, spoke up, his voice uncertain. "But Abbot, who or what is causing the bell to ring? If spirits are present, what do they want? Why now, after all these years?" Koyu shook his head. "I do not know, but I think we must consider the context in which these events are occurring. Our city is in a state of transformation, preparing to celebrate its own history while simultaneously racing toward an uncertain future. The Heian Shrine will open in just 6 days, a shrine dedicated to remembering what we were while we struggle with what we are becoming. Perhaps something in this moment of tension between past and present has created conditions that allow the veil between worlds to grow thin. Another monk, Genti, asked, "What should we do, Abbot? Do we attempt to stop these ringings? To perform an exorcism or cleansing ritual?" Koyu considered this for a long moment. "I do not think we should try to stop what is happening. The spirits, if that is what they are, have not harmed us. They have not damaged the temple. They are simply ringing the bell, using it for its intended purpose, to create sound that reaches across the boundary between living and dead, material and spiritual. If we try to stop them, to drive them away, we may cause more harm than good. We may offend forces we do not understand." "Then what, Abbot?" This from Takashi, who had found his voice again. "Do we simply wait and watch? Do we allow this to continue?" "For now, yes," Koya said. "We will continue our watches. We will observe and record what happens. And I will seek counsel from other temples, from those who have studied such matters more deeply than I have. There are texts, old accounts of similar phenomena. Perhaps in them we will find guidance." The gathering broke up as dawn light began to filter through the hall's windows, the men dispersing to their duties or their beds of the shared understanding that their world had expanded to include things that, until 2 nights ago, they would have considered impossible. And in his quarters, Takashi lay down but did not sleep, staring at the ceiling and wondering what the next night would bring, what message these spirits were trying to send, and whether the living were capable of understanding what the dead were trying to communicate through the voice of an ancient bell. Part 4. Spirits of the Heian Past. To understand the spirits that might be drawn to a temple bell in Kyoto, particularly during a time of great change and celebration of the city's ancient past, we must delve into the rich and complex world of Japanese supernatural belief, a world populated by entities both beautiful and terrible, benevolent and malevolent, existing in a state of constant interaction with the realm of the living. The Japanese term for ghosts, yurei, encompasses a range of spiritual entities, but all share certain characteristics. Unlike Western ghosts, which can appear at any time and are often indistinguishable from living people, yurei have specific visual markers and temporal preferences. They typically appear during the hours of the ox, between 2 and 3 in the morning, when the veil between worlds is thinnest. They manifest wearing white funeral garments, their long black hair hanging loose and disheveled, their arms hanging limply at their sides, or held forward in supplication or threat. Often, they have no feet, hovering or floating above the ground. Frequently, they are accompanied by Haido Dama, floating spheres of ghostly flame in colors like blue, green, or purple. But the appearance of yurei is less important than their nature. According to traditional Japanese belief, when a person dies, their spirit, or reikon, leaves the body and enters a form of purgatory where it awaits the proper funeral and post-funeral rites. If these rites are performed correctly, the reikon can join the ancestors and become a protective presence for the living family, returning once a year during the Bon Festival to receive offerings and thanks. But if the rites are not performed, or if the person died with strong emotions left unresolved, intense desires unfulfilled, or terrible wrongs unavenged, the reikon cannot move on. It becomes trapped in the liminal space between life and death, unable to rest, unable to progress, transforming into a yurei that haunts the living world. There are several types of yurei, classified by the nature of their earthly attachments. The most feared are the onryo, vengeful ghosts who died harboring profound resentment towards someone or something. These spirits are extremely dangerous, capable of causing illness, madness, and death to those they target. The classic examples from Japanese history and literature include figures like Oiwa, whose husband poisoned her, causing her face to become horribly disfigured before she died, and whose ghost tormented him relentlessly, appearing everywhere he looked, driving him to madness and death. Or Okiku, the servant girl who was falsely accused of losing a valuable plate and thrown down a well, whose ghost would emerge from that well every night to count plates, her voice rising from 1, 2, 3 up to 9, then dissolving into terrible sobbing because the 10th plate could never be found. Then there are the Ubyum, spirits of women who died in childbirth, unable to rest because of their overwhelming concern for their newborn children. These ghosts would appear to purchase candy or other necessities for their infants, paying with leaves that turned to money, returning night after night until someone followed them and discovered the crying baby they had hidden away before dying. Unlike onryo, Ubyum are not actively malevolent, but their sadness is so profound, their maternal instinct so strong, that they cannot move on even in death. Funeuriai are the spirits of those who died at sea, particularly those who drowned or died in shipwrecks. They are said to appear to sailors, attempting to capsize boats or pull living people into the water to join them in their watery graves. These spirits often hold ladles, which they use to scoop water into vessels to sink them, a detail that feels both prosaic and terrifying. The city of Kyoto, with its 1,000-year history as imperial capital, is particularly rich in ghost stories and hauntings. The city has seen wars, fires, earthquakes, political intrigue, assassinations, and countless personal tragedies, each potentially creating spirits that linger in the places where their lives ended or where their strongest emotions were tied. During the Heian period, the belief in vengeful spirits became so strong that a new religious movement developed specifically to address them, the Goryo Shinko, or spirit pacifying faith. Temples were established dedicated to appeasing difficult souls, offering them prayers, rituals, and recognition of their suffering in hopes of calming their anger and allowing them to move on. Some spirits were so powerful and so dangerous that they were eventually deified, transformed from threatening ghosts into kami, gods or godlike beings worthy of worship. This happened to several court nobles who died in political purges and whose angry spirits were believed to be causing disasters, epidemics, and other calamities. By elevating them to divine status and building shrines in their honor, the living hoped to transform their vengeful power into protective power, turning former enemies into guardians. But yurei are not the only supernatural entities in Japanese belief. There are also the yokai, a term that encompasses a vast and varied collection of creatures, spirits, and phenomena that are supernatural but not necessarily the spirits of dead humans. Yokai can be animals that have acquired supernatural powers, often through age and wisdom. The most famous examples are the kitsune, foxes that can shapeshift into human form, and the tanuki, raccoon dogs that are tricksters and shapeshifters. There are tsukamagami, objects that have acquired spirits after existing for 100 years, including everything from old sandals to abandoned musical instruments to, relevantly for our story, bells. The belief in tsukumogami reflects a deeply animistic worldview. The Shinto conception that all things possess a spiritual essence, a kami that could become conscious and active under certain conditions. An object that has been used extensively, that has been cared for and valued over a long period, can develop a spirit of its own, a personality, and will independent of its makers or users. When such objects are discarded or forgotten, their spirits can become angry, leading to hauntings or other supernatural disturbances. In the context of Shorinji's ringing bell, all of these traditions and beliefs became relevant. Was the bell being rung by human spirits? Yurei drawn to the temple by some unfinished business or unfulfilled need? Or had the bell itself, after 3 centuries of use, after being struck tens of thousands of times, after absorbing the prayers and intentions of countless people, developed its own spiritual essence, its own will to ring when it sensed the presence of spirits who needed to hear its voice? Abbot Koyu, determined to find answers, or at least context for what was happening, spent the days following the second inexplicable ringing, searching through the temple's small library of texts. He pulled down dusty volumes that hadn't been opened in decades, works of Buddhist philosophy and folk belief, compilations of supernatural account from across Japan's history. He read late into each night, his eyes straining in the lamplight, searching for some precedent, some similar occurrence that might offer guidance. What he found both illuminated and deepened the mystery. There were, he discovered, accounts going back centuries of temple bells behaving strangely at times of great upheaval or change. During the Genpei War in the late 12th century, which saw the fall of the Taira clan and the rise of the Minamoto, establishing the first shogunate, there were reports from temples across Japan of bells ringing at odd hours, sometimes in patterns that seemed to convey messages, warnings of impending battles or deaths of important figures. In the 16th century, during the Sengoku period of constant warfare, there were multiple accounts of temple bells ringing themselves on the nights before major battles, as if the spirits of those who were about to die were already gathering, drawn by some prescient awareness of their approaching deaths. One particularly detailed account from a temple in what is now Fukushima Prefecture described how the temple's bell rang for hours on the night before a catastrophic battle, and when dawn came, the monks found that the bell had physically moved several inches from its usual position, as if the force ringing it had been strong enough to shift the massive bronze object. More recently, following the Meiji Restoration in 1868, there had been scattered reports of supernatural phenomena at temples and shrines across Japan, as if the profound changes sweeping through society were creating disturbances in the spiritual realm as well. The abolition of the shogunate, the restoration of imperial power, the sudden opening to Western influence after 2.5 centuries of isolation, all of this had happened with breathtaking speed, and there were many, particularly among the older generation, who died bewildered and displaced, unable to understand the world their country was becoming. Koyu read one account that particularly resonated with their current situation. At a temple in Nara, shortly after the Meiji Restoration, the temple bell had begun ringing at midnight, always exactly 108 times, for a period of 7 consecutive nights. The monks, terrified and uncertain what to do, had eventually called in a Shinto priest skilled in spirit communication. Through elaborate rituals, the priest had determined that the bell was being rung by the spirits of samurai who had died during the final conflicts between shogunate loyalists and imperial forces, warriors who could not rest because the world they had known the social order they had sworn to uphold, had been completely overthrown. The priest had performed ceremonies to help these spirits understand that, though the world had changed, their honor and sacrifice had not been meaningless, that they could release their attachment to the old order and move on. After the seventh night, the bell stopped its midnight ringing and returned to normal function. The account ended with a note that several of the temple's monks reported seeing, on that final night, a procession of figures in samurai armor walking away from the temple toward the nearby hills, fading into mist as they went. This story gave Koi much to think about. Kyoto in 1895 was in a situation parallel to that Nara temple shortly after the restoration. The city was celebrating its Heian past, building a shrine to commemorate emperors from that golden age, while simultaneously rushing toward modernization, installing electric tram lines, adopting Western architecture and fashion, transforming itself in ways that would have been unimaginable just a generation earlier. Was it possible that spirits from Kyoto's long history were being drawn forth by this complex mixture of remembrance and change? Were they using the temple bell to announce their presence, to remind the living that the past was not truly past, that the dead still had a claim on the attention and respect of those who came after them? Koya shared his findings with the other monks during their evening gathering, and a long discussion ensued about what, if anything, they should do. Some argued for calling in outside help, perhaps a Shinto priest or a specialist in Buddhist exorcism. Others felt strongly that they should handle the matter themselves, that it was their temple, their bell, their responsibility. A few suggested they should simply let events unfold, that if the spirits needed to ring the bell, they should be allowed to do so until they had accomplished whatever purpose drove them. It was Takashi who eventually offered an insight that shifted the discussion. "Abbot," he said, "forgive me for speaking, but I have a thought. The Heian Shrine will open in 3 days. The city will celebrate the founding of ancient Heian, will honor the first and last emperors who ruled from here. This celebration is meant to connect Kyoto's present to its illustrious past. Perhaps what is happening at our temple is part of that same connection, reaching across time, but initiated from the other direction, from the past reaching toward the present. Perhaps the spirits are responding to the city's act of remembrance. And perhaps when the shrine is dedicated and the ceremonies are complete, they will be satisfied and will quiet themselves." Koya regarded Takashi with surprise and approval. "That is a perceptive observation. You may well be right. The timing certainly suggests a connection. The bell began ringing 2 nights after the anniversary date, and we have 3 nights until the shrine dedication. Perhaps we should wait, continue our observations, and see if the pattern resolves itself once the city has completed its act of remembrance." And so was decided. They would continue their nightly watches, would continue to observe and record, but would not intervene, would not attempt to stop or control what was happening. If the spirits needed to ring the bell was there for them to ring. That was, after all, one of the bell's purposes, to reach across the boundary between life and death, to offer the Dharma to all beings in all states of existence. Who were they, the living monks, to deny the dead that opportunity? The 3rd night passed much as the 2nd had. During the deepest hours, in that time when the world holds its breath between midnight and dawn, the bell rang itself 108 times, slow and deliberate, each strike perfect in tone and rhythm. The watchers, Ryujin and Shokiai on this night, reported the same phenomena Takashi and Daichi had witnessed, the sense of presence, the suggestion of gathered figures, the feeling of being in the proximity of something vast and profound that was using the bell to manifest, however briefly, in the material world. On the fourth night, the watchers were Genti and another monk named Joshu. They sat together outside the bell tower, wrapped in their warmest robes, for the nights were still cold despite the approach of spring. Joshu was the temple's youngest monk, only 23 years old, and this was his first encounter with anything truly supernatural. He was terrified but determined not to show it, his pride warring with his fear in a way that Genti, who had been young once himself, recognized and gently ignored. The bell rang again that night, and this time something new happened. As the bell tolled, as the deep reverberating notes flowed out across the city, Joshu heard within those notes something that sounded like voices, not speaking words he could understand, but nevertheless communicating something, some emotion or intention that bypassed language and reached directly into his heart. He heard sorrow in those voices and longing and a kind of desperate urgency, as if the speakers were trying with all their strength to convey something vital, to reach across an unbridgeable distance and make themselves understood. Tears began to run down Joshua's face, though he couldn't have said why he was crying. The voices in the bell were heartbreaking, but they were also beautiful, and beneath the sorrow and urgency, there was something else, something that might have been gratitude or relief, as if these spirits were grateful simply to be heard, to be acknowledged, to be given this opportunity to speak through the bell's bronze voice to the world they had left behind. When the 108th strike faded and silence returned, Joshu found himself sitting on the cold stone, sobbing openly, his entire body shaking with emotion he could neither control nor fully understand. Genti put an arm around the young monk's shoulders and held him, letting him cry, knowing from his own experience that sometimes the encounter with the truly numinous, with forces and presences that transcend ordinary human experience, can crack open the heart in ways that are simultaneously painful and necessary. Later, when they reported to Abbot Koyu, Joshu tried to explain what he had heard in the bell's voice, but words failed him. How do you describe hearing the voices of the dead? How do you convey the emotional weight of spirits who have been silent for decades or centuries, suddenly given the opportunity to speak? Koyu listened patiently, asked no questions, and finally said simply, "You have been blessed and burdened by this experience. It will change you. Let it change you in ways that deepen your compassion and strengthen your practice." One more night remained before the dedication of the Heian shrine. One more night of watching, one more night of the bell ringing itself, one more night of spirits gathering to hear its voice and speak through it. And Takashi, lying in his residence, staring at the ceiling as had become his habit during these strange days, found himself no longer afraid. The fear had transmuted into something else, into a kind of odd acceptance, into an understanding that he was witnessing something profound, something that might happen only once in a generation or a century, a moment when the barrier between worlds grew so thin that traffic could flow both ways, when the living could see the dead and the dead could make themselves heard by the living. Tomorrow night would be the final watch before the shrine dedication. Takashi had requested to be part of that final watch, paired with Abbot Koyu himself. He had a feeling, though he couldn't have explained its source, that something significant would happen, something that would bring these mysterious events to their resolution. Whether he was right or wrong, he would be there to witness it, standing watch over a bell that had become a bridge between worlds, a portal through which the past could speak to the present, through which the dead could remind the living that memory is not merely a nostalgic exercise, but a sacred obligation, that those who came before us are not truly gone as long as we remember them, honor them, and listen when they try to speak to us across the vast silence of death. Part 5. The Investigation. As the days progressed toward the Heian shrine dedication, word of the strange events at Shorinji had spread throughout Kyoto's Buddhist community, carried by the informal network of connections between temples that formed an invisible web across the city. Monks gossiped just like anyone else, and a story as compelling as a self-ringing bell could not be kept secret for long, particularly when the bell's voice carried for miles and could be heard by anyone awake during those dark hours when it chose to ring. Other temples began reporting similar phenomena. At a Tendai temple in the northern hills, a group of young monks claimed to have seen figures in ancient court dress walking through the temple gardens at night, figures that vanished when approached but left behind the scent of incense and old fabric. At a Shinto shrine near the Kamo River, the head priest reported that the shrine's offerings of rice and sake were being mysteriously depleted each morning, as if invisible hands were taking them during the night, and twice he had heard what sounded like aristocratic courtiers laughing and speaking in the archaic dialect of the Heian period. Even in the city itself, beyond the religious precincts, strange things were occurring. Several residents of older neighborhoods reported dreams in which figures dressed in clothing from centuries past would appear and speak to them about changes to the city they didn't understand, asking about buildings that no longer existed, about streets that had been rerouted or renamed. One elderly man claimed that a woman in full Heian court dress, her 12-layered kimono cascading around her like a waterfall of silk, had appeared in his family's garden and asked him in formal classical Japanese about the fate of the imperial palace, seeming not to understand that it had been emptied decades ago when the emperor moved to Tokyo. These reports prompted a gathering of senior monks and priests from several of Kyoto's most important temples. They met at Nanzenji, a large Rinzai Zen temple in the Higashiyama district, not far from Shorinji. Abbot Koyu was invited to attend and to share his temple's experiences with the assembled religious leaders. The meeting took place in Nanzenji's great lecture hall, a vast space with wooden floors polished by centuries of footsteps and walls decorated with classical paintings of scenes from Buddhist scripture. 23 monks and priests sat in a wide circle, and the atmosphere was serious, even somber. This was not a gathering to discuss theology or administrative matters, but to address something far more immediate and unsettling: an apparent weakening of the boundary between the living world and the realm of spirits, occurring at a time when the city was celebrating its history and racing toward its future. Koyu stood and, with his customary quiet dignity, described what had been happening at Shorinji. He provided precise details, times, observations, the testimonies of multiple witnesses. He described the bell ringing exactly 108 times, the sense of presence around the bell tower, the luminescence that Takashi and Daichi had witnessed, the voices that young Joshu had heard within the bell's tones. He did not embellish or dramatize. He simply presented the facts as he understood them. When he finished, there was a long silence. Finally, the abbot of Nanzenji itself, an elderly monk named Soten who was widely respected for his scholarship and spiritual insight, spoke. "What you describe, Abbot Koyu, is consistent with accounts from throughout our history of times when the veil between worlds grows thin. This often occurs during periods of great change or upheaval, when the social order is being transformed and people are caught between what was and what is becoming. The Meiji Restoration was such a time. The years of civil war that ended the shogunate were such a time. We are, I believe, in another such time now, though the change is more subtle, more cultural than political. Another monk, representing a Pure Land temple, added, "But why temples? Why bells specifically? If spirits are being drawn forth by the city's celebration of its past, why are they manifesting at religious sites rather than the imperial palace grounds or other historically significant locations?" Koyu answered, "I've been thinking about this. I believe it is because temples and shrines are already liminal spaces, places that exist at the boundary between the mundane and sacred, between the material and spiritual. Our bells, our rituals, our very purpose is to facilitate communication between realms. If spirits need to manifest, need to make themselves known, they would naturally be drawn to places where the boundary is already thin, where channels of communication already exist. A Shinto priest, distinguished by his white robes and tall hat, offered his perspective. In Shinto understanding, the kami, the spirits that inhabit all things, can become restless when places and practices change too rapidly. If buildings are torn down, if traditions are abandoned, if the old ways of honoring the spirits are neglected, the kami can become disturbed, even angry. Perhaps what we are experiencing is the collective disturbance of countless spirits who are confused by how quickly Kyoto has changed, by how much has been lost in the rush toward modernization. This perspective prompted a vigorous discussion. Some argued that modernization was necessary and inevitable, that Japan had to adapt to survive in a world dominated by Western powers, and that spirits should understand this practical necessity. Others countered that practical necessity did not absolve the living of their obligation to the dead, that change could be accomplished with respect for tradition, that one need not abandon the old to embrace the new. Soten raised his hand, calling for quiet. These are important questions, but they are not questions we can answer definitively today. What we can do is agree on how to respond to what is happening. I propose that we do not attempt to suppress or exorcise these manifestations. Instead, we should acknowledge them, honor them, and try to understand what message they carry. He continued, "Tomorrow night is the dedication of the Heian shrine. The emperor himself will not attend, but his representatives will be there, along with thousands of citizens. It will be a moment of collective remembrance, of the city acknowledging its debt to the past while affirming its place in the present. I believe that this event will serve as a kind of resolution, a satisfying of whatever need is driving these spirits to manifest. After tomorrow night, I suspect the phenomena will cease or at least diminish significantly." Koyu agreed with this assessment. That has been my sense as well. The timing of the bell ringings, beginning 7 days before the dedication and likely ending with it, suggests that the spirits are responding to the act of remembrance the city is undertaking. Once that act is complete, once they have been acknowledged and honored, I believe they will return to their rest. The gathering concluded with an agreement to continue monitoring supernatural phenomena across the city's temples and shrines, and to reconvene after the shrine dedication to assess whether the manifestations had indeed ceased. The monks and priests also agreed to share their observations and insights, recognizing that they were witnessing something significant, an event that would likely be studied and discussed for generations. As Koyu walked back to Shorinji through streets that were becoming busy with preparation for the next day's festivities, he reflected on the meeting and on the broader implications of what they were experiencing. The Meiji era had brought so many changes to Japan, so much that was new and strange. But in their rush to modernize, to catch up with the West, to secure their nation's place among the world's powers, had the Japanese people forgotten something essential? Had they moved too quickly, left too much behind? The Heian Shrine was an attempt to address this loss, to create a space that honored the past, but was a replica of an ancient palace, however beautiful, truly sufficient? Could you recapture what had been lost by building a shrine to it? Or was something more fundamental required, a deeper commitment to maintaining continuity with the past even as you moved into the future, a recognition that the dead deserve more than monuments, that they require living memory, active honoring, and the acknowledgement that their lives and struggles were not meaningless? These questions troubled Koyu, but also gave him hope. The very fact that they were being asked, that people were paying attention to these supernatural manifestations rather than dismissing them as superstition, suggested that perhaps the Japanese spirit was more resilient than it sometimes appeared, that beneath the Western suits and electric tram lines and modern factories, there remained a connection to older and deeper truths about the relationship between living and dead, between past and present, between the material world and the spiritual realm that gives it meaning. Back at Shorinji, the other monks and Takashi were waiting to hear about the meeting. Koyu gathered them in the meditation hall and shared what had been discussed, the consensus that had been reached. They would continue their watch tonight, the final night before the dedication. They would be present to witness whatever occurred. And then, after tomorrow's ceremonies, they would see if Soten's prediction proved correct, if the spirits would be satisfied by the city's act of remembrance and would return to their rest. As evening approached and the time for the watch drew near, Takashi prepared himself with particular care. He bathed and changed into his cleanest clothes, approaching the night's duties with the same seriousness he might bring to an important ceremony. This final watch felt significant in ways he couldn't fully articulate. He had the sense that something would be resolved tonight, some message finally delivered clearly enough to be understood. Abbot Koyu was waiting at the bell tower when Takashi arrived. The old monk looked tired but also strangely excited, his eyes bright with anticipation. "Tonight," he said simply, "we will understand." They took their positions on the stone bench, both of them facing the bell tower, and settled into wait. The sky was clear, stars bright in the darkness, and a nearly full moon cast silver light across the temple grounds, making everything look dreamlike and slightly unreal. The air was cold but still, without even a whisper of wind to disturb the temple's profound quietness. As midnight approached, Takashi felt the now familiar change in atmosphere, that sudden thickening of the air, that sensation of invisible presence gathering around them. But tonight, it felt different, more peaceful somehow, less urgent and desperate than it had felt before. The sense was not of spirits forcing their way into the living world, but of a door being gently opened, an invitation being extended and accepted. The bell began to ring, and from the very first strike, Takashi knew this time would be different. The tone was purer than he had ever heard it, more resonant, as if every harmonic the bell was capable of producing was being activated simultaneously, creating a sound so rich and complex that it seemed less like a sound and more like a living presence itself. The bell rang, and the sound flowed out across the city, and Takashi had the overwhelming sensation that everyone in Kyoto could hear it, that people were stirring in their sleep, that they were dreaming of ancient times, of emperors and courtiers, of a city that had once been the center of the world. And then, as the bell continued its measured tolling, Takashi saw them. Not vaguely, not as suggestions of form and presence, but clearly, distinctly. Figures were gathering around the bell tower, dozens of them, perhaps hundreds, emerging from the darkness as if they had always been there, but only now chose to be visible. They wore clothing from across Kyoto's thousand-year history, court dress from the Heian period, samurai armor from the wars of the medieval era, the simple robes of monks and nuns, the working clothes of merchants and craftspeople. Men and women, young and old, an assembly of spirits representing every era, every class, every walk of life that had ever existed in this city. They were not frightening. There was nothing threatening or malevolent about them. They simply stood and listened to the bell, their faces upturned, their expressions peaceful, some with tears running down their cheeks. They were hearing something in the bell's voice that Takashi could not quite hear himself, some message or reassurance that reached them in their non-corporeal state, that told them they had not been forgotten, that the living still honored them, still remembered, still acknowledged the debt they owed to those who had lived and died in this place. The bell rang its full count of 108, and when the final tone began to fade, something extraordinary happened. The assembled spirits began to speak, not individually, but as a single voice, a chorus that spoke in the formal language of the Heian period, but which Takashi understood with perfect clarity, as if the meaning was being transmitted directly into his mind. "We who have gone before you," they said, "we who built this city and lived in it and died for it and loved it, we have been called forth by your act of remembrance. We have been given voice by this sacred bell. We come not to haunt or frighten, but to remind you that we are still here, woven into every stone of every street, every timber of every building, every tradition and practice that has been passed down through the generations. We are Kyoto, as much as you who live now are Kyoto. Do not forget us. Do not leave us behind in your rush toward the future. Honor what we were, what we gave, what we dreamed. Hold us in your hearts and your memories, and we will hold you in return, protecting you, guiding you, blessing you with the wisdom that comes from having lived and died and learned what truly matters." The voice faded, and the assembled spirits began to fade as well, dissolving like morning mist, their forms becoming transparent and then invisible until only the moonlight and the shadows remained. The last thing Takashi saw was what appeared to be an aristocratic woman from the Heian period, her 12-layered kimono cascading around her, smiling with such serene beauty that his breath caught, and then she too was gone, and he and Abbot Ku sat alone on the stone bench in the silence that followed the bell's voice. For a long time, neither man spoke. Finally, Koyu said, his voice rough with emotion, "Did you hear them? Did you understand?" "Yes," Takashi whispered. "Yes, I heard. I understood. They're satisfied," Koyu said. "They have been acknowledged. Tomorrow, when the Heian shrine is dedicated, when thousands gather to honor the past, the spirits will know that they have not been forgotten. And knowing that, they can rest. They can release their hold on this world and trust that they are held in the world's memory." They sat together until dawn began to lighten the eastern sky, neither of them wanting to leave, both sensing that they had been present at something sacred, something that happened rarely in the world, a moment when the barrier between living and dead had dissolved entirely, when communication had flowed freely in both directions, when the past and present had touched and recognized each other. When they finally rose and made their way back to the main temple building, Takashi turned for one last look at the bell tower. In the growing light, it looked entirely ordinary, just a wooden structure on a hillside, sheltering a bronze bell that had rung the hours for 300 years. But he knew now that it was more than that. It was a gateway, a threshold, a place where worlds met. And he felt honored beyond measure to have been its guardian during these extraordinary days. Part 6, The Revelation. The day of the Heian shrine dedication dawned bright and clear, the kind of perfect spring day that poets wrote about, when the sky stretched overhead like blue silk and cherry blossoms drifted on gentle breezes like snow that refused to melt. All across Kyoto, people woke with a sense of anticipation, of being on the cusp of something significant. The city had been building toward this moment for months, and now it had finally arrived. Takashi rose early despite having slept only a few hours after the night's watch. He felt no exhaustion, only a strange lightness, as if some weight he hadn't known he was carrying had been lifted from him. As he went through his morning duties, sweeping the paths and tending to the temple's daily needs, he found himself moving differently, more mindfully, as if each small action carried new significance. Every stone he touched, every branch he pruned, every flower he arranged was connected to those spirits he had seen the night before, all those generations who had performed these same simple tasks in their own times, who had loved this temple and this city just as he did. The other monks also seemed changed by the week's events, moving through their routines with unusual gravity and awareness. At breakfast, eaten in traditional silence, Takashi caught several of them glancing toward the bell tower, their expressions thoughtful. They knew something had concluded, that a threshold had been crossed, but the full meaning of it would take time to unfold. After the morning meal, Abbot Koyu called them together one final time to discuss the night's events and what they would do going forward. They gathered in the meditation hall, the morning light streaming through the windows, illuminating dust motes that drifted like tiny spirits in the golden air. Koyu spoke first, describing in detail what he and Takashi had witnessed, the vast assembly of spirits, the collective voice, the message they had delivered. The other monks listened with rapt attention, and when Koyu finished, several of them had tears in their eyes. What they said to us, Koyu continued, was not just for our temple, but for the entire city, for all of Japan perhaps. In our eagerness to modernize, to become a nation that could stand alongside the Western powers, we have sometimes acted as if the past were an embarrassment, something to be discarded or hidden away. But the spirits reminded us that we are built on their foundation, that we inherit everything they created and everything they learned, and that forgetting them diminishes us far more than it honors them. He paused, looking around the circle at each monk. The Heian shrine being dedicated today is important, but it is only a symbol. What matters more is what it represents. The choice to remember, the decision to maintain continuity with our history even as we move into an uncertain future. The spirits have been satisfied by this choice. They have been heard. But the responsibility now falls to us, the living, to continue making that choice, to continue honoring those who came before us, not just through monuments and ceremonies, but through how we live, how we practice, how we maintain the traditions that connect us to them. Young Joshu raised his hand tentatively. Abbot, will the bell ring itself again? Will we see the spirits return? Koyu considered this. I do not know for certain, but I believe that particular manifestation has served its purpose and will not repeat. The spirits came because they needed to be acknowledged at this crucial moment, when the city was turning its attention deliberately to its past. They have been acknowledged. They have delivered their message. I expect they will return to their rest, content that they have not been forgotten. But, he added with a small smile, the bell remains what it has always been. A threshold, a gateway between worlds. Its voice still carries beyond the purely physical realm. And who can say what future circumstances might call forth those on the other side to make use of it again? As the gathering dispersed, Takashi made his way up to the bell tower one more time. He wanted to see it in daylight, to assure himself that it was still the familiar object he had known all his life. The morning sun illuminated the bell surface, highlighting every detail of the ancient inscriptions, the names of long-dead donors, the prayers that had been cast into the bronze 3 centuries ago. He reached out and placed his hand flat against the cold metal, and this time he felt nothing unusual, no mysterious vibration, no sense of hidden presence. Just bronze, just metal shaped and cast by human hands for a sacred purpose. But knowing what he now knew, understanding what the bell truly was and what it could do, Takashi felt a deeper reverence for it than he ever had before. This was not merely a beautiful artifact or a functional tool for marking time. This was an instrument of connection between realms, proof that the boundary between living and dead was not absolute, that under certain circumstances, in certain moments, that boundary could thin to nothing and voices could cross from one side to the other. He descended from the tower and began preparing for the day's journey into the city. The temple had been invited to send representatives to the shrine dedication, and Abbot Koyu had chosen Takashi, along with 2 other monks, to attend. It was both an honor and an acknowledgement of Takashi's central role in the week's extraordinary events. They set out in mid-morning, walking the familiar paths that led down from the hillside into the city proper. Kyoto was transformed. Every street was decorated with lanterns and banners. People wore their finest clothes, and the atmosphere was festive but also reverent, as if the entire city understood it was participating in something more significant than a mere celebration. The route to the new Heian shrine took them through neighborhoods old and new, past ancient wooden houses with their characteristic lattice fronts, and past modern brick buildings that housed banks and offices, past traditional craft shops selling pottery and textiles, and past stores displaying Western goods, typewriters and bicycles, and ready-made clothing. The juxtaposition was striking, this mixture of old and new existing side by side, sometimes comfortably, sometimes uneasily, but undeniably together, creating something that was neither purely traditional nor purely modern, but uniquely Japanese. As they walked, Takashi found himself looking at the city with new eyes. Everywhere he looked, he could see layers of history, the present moment resting on foundations laid by previous generations. That corner shop selling imported coffee beans stood on ground where a Heian-era mansion had once risen. That modern bank occupied the site of a medieval samurai residence. Every street, every building, every stone was a palimpsest, layer upon layer of human activity, each generation adding its contribution to the accumulating story of the city. The crowd grew thicker as they approached the Okazaki district where the new shrine had been built. Thousands of people were converging on the site, drawn by curiosity and civic pride, by the desire to witness this moment of collective remembrance. The scale of the gathering was remarkable, a visible demonstration of how deeply the city's residents cared about their history, how much they wanted to honor it, even as they participated in creating a new Japan. When the Heian shrine finally came into view, Takashi caught his breath. He had seen it under construction over the previous months, had watched the massive vermilion torii gate rise, taller than any gate he had ever seen, marking the approach to the shrine. But now, completed and consecrated, it was overwhelming in its beauty and scale. The torii stood 60 feet high, its brilliant red color blazing against the blue sky. Beyond it, the shrine buildings themselves rose in perfect symmetry, faithful reproductions of the ancient Heian Palace's Kyoto complex, though built at 5/8 scale. The main hall, with its sweeping roof and ornate details, the east and west gate towers, the white gravel courtyard that spread before them like a field of snow, all of it combined to create a space that felt simultaneously ancient and brand new, a place where past and present coexisted without contradiction. The dedication ceremony was scheduled to begin at noon, and as that hour approached, the crowd settled into expectant silence. Representatives from the imperial household, government officials, Buddhist priests and Shinto priests, scholars and dignitaries from across Japan, all took their places in the carefully arranged seating areas. Takashi and his companions found a spot among the general public, close enough to see, but not so close as to intrude on the formal proceedings. When the ceremony began, it followed traditional Shinto protocols, the priests performing purification rituals, offering prayers, presenting symbolic gifts to the enshrined deities. Emperor Kanmu, who had founded Heian in 794, and Emperor Komeei, who had been the last emperor to rule from Kyoto. The rituals were ancient, unchanged in form for centuries, and watching them, Takashi understood why the spirits had been satisfied. This was more than the opening of a new shrine. It was a statement, a declaration that Kyoto valued its past, that the city acknowledged its debt to all those who had come before, that history was not something to be discarded, but something to be honored and preserved. As the priests chanted their prayers, Takashi became aware of something extraordinary. The air around the shrine seemed to shimmer, not visibly, but in some other way, as if reality itself had become slightly translucent. And in that shimmer, he thought he could see them again, the spirits, not as clearly as he had seen them the previous night, but present nonetheless, gathered around the shrine, witnessing this moment, these thousands of departed souls who had loved this city and who had been called forth by its act of remembrance. He glanced at Abbot Koyu and saw that the old monk was smiling, tears running down his weathered face, and Takashi knew that Koyu saw them too, that perhaps many of the people gathered here could sense, if not quite see, the presence of those who had gone before, all those generations of Kyoto's residents who had built this city and lived in it and died for it, who were being honored today, not just symbolically, but actually, their presence acknowledged, their importance affirmed. The ceremony reached its climax with a formal presentation of the imperial messenger's offerings and the reading of a proclamation honoring the two emperors and celebrating Kyoto's 1,000-year history. As the proclamation was read, its formal language echoing across the white gravel courtyard, Takashi felt a wave of emotion so powerful it nearly buckled his knees. This was what the spirits had needed, This moment of collective acknowledgement, this gathering of thousands of people all turning their attention simultaneously to the past, all saying together, "We remember. We honor you. You are not forgotten." And as if in response to that collective statement, temple bells across the entire city began to ring. Not just one or two, but dozens, perhaps hundreds, all the bells in all the temples and shrines, ringing together in a great chorus that flowed across Kyoto like a tidal wave of sound. No one had coordinated this. No signal had been given, but the bells rang nonetheless, as if responding to some invisible cue, some shift in the spiritual atmosphere of the city that they could sense even if the humans around them could not. The crowd gasped and then fell silent, listening to this unexpected symphony of bells. The sound was overwhelming, layer upon layer of bronze voices, each bell with its own tone and character, but all of them together creating a harmonic texture so rich and complex that it seemed to exist in more dimensions than the human ear could fully process. The sound washed over the assembled crowd like a blessing, like a benediction, like a confirmation that what they were doing here mattered, that their act of remembrance had been received and acknowledged by forces beyond the purely human. The ringing continued for several minutes, and during that time, Takashi stood with his eyes closed, letting the sound flow through him, feeling it resonate in his chest and bones, understanding that he was witnessing something that might never happen again in his lifetime, a moment when the living and the dead were in perfect communion, when the boundary between worlds had dissolved completely, when past and present existed in the same space, occupying the same moment, acknowledging each other. With perfect clarity, when the bells finally fell silent, the hush that followed was profound. Even the children in the crowd stood motionless, sensing without fully understanding that something sacred had just occurred. Then, slowly, people began to move and speak again, but their voices were subdued, respectful, as if they were emerging from a temple after deep meditation and were not yet ready to return fully to the ordinary world. The formal ceremony concluded with more prayers and offerings, and then the crowd was invited to approach the shrine, to pass through the torii gate and enter the sacred precincts, to pay their respects to the enshrined emperors. Takashi and his companions joined the slow-moving line of people, shuffling forward step by step, waiting their turn to approach the offering hall. When Takashi finally stood before the shrine, when he bowed and clapped his hands in the traditional gesture of respect, he felt a profound sense of completion, as if a circle had been closed, as if something that had been broken had been made whole. The spirits had been satisfied. The bells had rung. The city had remembered. And now, perhaps, everyone could move forward, the living continuing their lives, the dead continuing their rest, but with the understanding that the two were not separate, not truly, that the past and present were woven together in ways that transcended simple chronology, that the dead remained part of the living world as long as the living chose to remember them, honor them, and listen when they tried to speak. The walk back to Shorinji took place in a kind of trance. Takashi moved through the still crowded streets without really seeing them, his mind replaying the day's events, the week's events, trying to process and integrate everything that had happened. The city looked the same as it had that morning, but it felt different, lighter somehow, as if a great tension had been released, as if everyone was breathing more easily. When they finally reached the temple grounds, the sun was setting, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple. The evening bell ringing would happen soon, and Takashi prepared himself for it with particular care, approaching the bell tower with deep reverence, bowing lower than usual before entering, taking extra time to ensure everything was perfect. He rang the bell that evening as he had rung it thousands of times before, pulling the rope, releasing the striking beam, allowing it to make contact with the bronze surface, producing that deep, resonant tone that flowed out across the hillside. 1, 2, 3. He counted as he always did, maintaining the rhythm, giving each strike the attention and mindfulness it deserved. But tonight, the act felt different. Tonight, he understood more fully what he was doing, understood that this simple ritual was not just marking time, but creating a bridge, sending sound across the boundary between worlds, offering the Dharma to all beings in all states of existence. When he reached the 108th strike and released the rope for the final time, Takashi stood in the fading light and listened to the bell's voice as it gradually diminished, fading into silence. And in that silence, in the stillness that followed, he felt a profound peace, a sense that everything was as it should be, that the temple and its bell had served their purpose, that the spirits had been heard and honored, and that now, finally, everyone could rest. That night, for the first time in over a week, Takashi slept deeply and dreamlessly, untroubled by visions or anxieties. The mystery had been solved. The message had been delivered. The past had spoken to the present, and the present had listened. What more could be asked? In the days that followed, life at Shorinji returned to its familiar routines. The bell rang each evening at the appointed hour, but it rang only when Takashi rang it, moving only when he pulled the rope, manifesting no supernatural behavior. The sense of presence that had charged the temple grounds during those extraordinary days faded, leaving behind only memory and the certainty that something profound had occurred, something that would be talked about and pondered for generations. Other temples across Kyoto reported similar returns to normalcy. The strange phenomena that had been occurring throughout the city, the visions of ancient courtiers, the mysterious depletion of offerings, the unexplained sounds and sensations, all of it ceased as abruptly as it had begun. It was as if the spirits, having been acknowledged and honored, had withdrawn behind the veil once more, content to remain in their proper realm, knowing they had not been forgotten. Part 7. The Legacy. The story of the bells that rang alone in Kyoto during the spring of 1895 became part of the city's folklore, passed down through generations, told and retold in tea houses and temple courtyards, written about in journals and local histories. Over time, as happens with all such stories, details were embellished, meanings debated, interpretations multiplied. Some dismissed the entire event as mass hysteria, a product of the heightened emotions surrounding the Heian shrine dedication. Others saw it as proof of the spirit world's reality, validation of traditional beliefs that modern rationalism sought to deny. But at Shorinji, among those who had actually witnessed the events, there was no doubt and no need for debate. They knew what they had seen. They knew what they had heard. And more importantly, they knew what it meant. The experience had changed them, had deepened their understanding of their practice, had made real and immediate things that had previously been only theoretical or abstract. For Takashi, the impact was particularly profound. He had always been devoted to his duties as temple custodian, but after that week, his devotion took on new dimensions. Every action he performed, every aspect of temple maintenance, was infused with awareness of the countless generations who had performed these same actions before him. When he swept the paths, he was walking alongside the custodians of centuries past. When he tended the gardens, he was collaborating with gardeners who had shaped these spaces decades or centuries ago. When he rang the bell each evening, he was adding his voice to a chorus that stretched back 300 years and would, he hoped, continue for centuries more. He also developed a new relationship with the bell itself. He had always respected it as a sacred object, but now he understood it as something more, a living presence in its own way, an entity that had absorbed and held 3 centuries of prayers, intentions, and spiritual energy. The bell had become a repository of memory, a witness to generations of practice, and in its moment of need, when spirits required a voice, it had offered itself as that voice, fulfilling its highest purpose. Takashi began keeping a journal, something he had never done before. In it, he recorded his observations about the temple, about the changing seasons, about the small moments of beauty and meaning that filled each day. But he also wrote about that extraordinary week, setting down every detail he could remember while the memories were still fresh, creating a record that future generations could consult when they wondered about the mysterious events of March 1895. Abbot Koyu also kept detailed records, more formal than Takashi's journal, documenting the dates, times, and specific phenomena observed during each night's watch. He wrote letters to other abbots and scholars, sharing what had happened and soliciting their interpretations and insights. Some responded with skepticism, suggesting natural explanations for each event, perhaps earthquakes too subtle for human senses to detect directly, but strong enough to set bells ringing, or air pressure changes that could produce similar effects. But others confirmed that they had experienced similar phenomena at their own temples and shared account from their own monastery records of previous occasions when bells had behaved mysteriously during times of great social change. One particularly thoughtful response came from an elderly monk at a temple in Kamakura, who wrote about the relationship between material objects and spiritual significance. A bell is metal, yes, he wrote, but it is metal that has been shaped and consecrated for sacred purpose. It has been prayed over, blessed, used for generations in the practice of Dharma. Over time, such objects become more than what they appear to be. They become anchored points in the spiritual landscape, fixed locations where the boundary between worlds is permanently thinner. It should not surprise us that when conditions are right, when the spiritual weather is appropriate, such objects can serve as conduits for communication between realms. This is not superstition. This is the natural consequence of how the world actually works once we understand that the world includes dimensions beyond the purely physical. This perspective resonated deeply with Koyu, and he copied the letter into his own records, adding his own reflections on how Buddhist practice created these anchored points in the spiritual landscape, and what responsibility temples therefore had to maintain them properly. As months and then years passed, the immediate intensity of the experience faded, but its influence remained. Shorinji became known throughout Kyoto as a place where the boundary between worlds was particularly thin, and people began to visit specifically because of this reputation. Some came seeking experiences of their own, hoping to encounter spirits or witness supernatural phenomena. These visitors were usually disappointed, as the extraordinary events of March 1895 did not repeat, at least not in any obvious or dramatic way. But others came seeking something different, a place where they could feel connected to the past, where they could honor their own ancestors, where they could experience the continuity of tradition in an increasingly modern world. These visitors often reported feeling a special quality to the temple, a peace and presence that they couldn't quite explain, but that moved them deeply. Some said they felt they were being watched over by benevolent spirits. Others described a sense of timelessness, as if the temple existed partially outside the normal flow of time. These experiences, while not as dramatic as the self-ringing bell, suggested that something of that extraordinary week had permanently altered the temple's spiritual character. Takashi, growing older and eventually training a successor to take over his duties, often thought about what the spirits had said during that final manifestation. Do not forget us. Do not leave us behind in your rush toward the future. This, he came to understand, was the central message not just for the temple, but for all of Japan as it navigated the challenges of modernization. The Meiji era had brought tremendous changes, most of them beneficial. The country had avoided colonization, had built a modern military and industrial base, had educated its population, and created new opportunities for all classes of people. But these achievements had come at a cost: paid and abandoned traditions, demolished buildings, discarded practices, and a sense among many, particularly the older generation, that something essential had been lost in the transformation. The Spirit's message offered a way forward that honored both past and future. Yes, modernize. Yes, adapt to the changing world. Yes, learn from other cultures and incorporate what is useful. But do not forget where you came from. Do not sever your connection to your ancestors. Do not treat your history as something to be ashamed of or hidden away. Instead, carry it with you. Let it inform and guide you. Maintain the practices and traditions that connect you to those who came before, and trust that this continuity, far from holding you back, will give you the strength and stability to face whatever challenges the future brings. This was not a conservative message advocating a return to the past or a rejection of modernity. It was something more nuanced, a call for balance, for mindful integration of old and new, for respecting the foundation even as you build new floors on the structure. And increasingly, as the Meiji era progressed and eventually gave way to the Taisho and then Showa periods, this message resonated with more and more people who felt disoriented by the pace of change and who sought ways to maintain their identity as Japanese while also being modern. The Heian Shrine, which had been the occasion for the Spirit's manifestation, became one of Kyoto's most beloved landmarks, visited by millions over the decades. The fact that it was a replica, a consciously constructed symbol of the past, rather than an actual historical structure, seemed not to matter. What mattered was what it represented: the decision to remember, the choice to honor history, the commitment to maintaining continuity with tradition. The shrine's popularity suggested that the spirits had been right to make their presence known during its dedication, that this was indeed a significant moment worth marking with supernatural intervention. As for the bell at Shorinji, it continued to ring twice daily, morning and evening, as it had for 3 centuries. Its voice continued to carry across the hillside and into the neighborhoods below, a familiar and comforting presence in people's lives. Children grew up hearing it, learned to recognize its particular tone and character, and carried that sound with them as they grew into adulthood, moved away, perhaps even left Japan entirely. But wherever they went, when they heard a temple bell, any temple bell, it would call up memories of home, of Kyoto, of the city where past and present coexisted in ways that seemed impossible anywhere else. Takashi eventually grew too old to climb the stairs to the bell tower every evening, and he passed his duties to a young man who had been training under him for several years. This successor, whose name was Kenji, listened carefully to all of Takashi's stories about the extraordinary week in 1895, and he promised to honor the bell and its history with the same reverence Takashi had shown. On Takashi's final evening as official temple custodian, Kenji insisted that the old man ring the bell one last time. They climbed the stairs together, slowly, Kenji supporting Takashi when his legs trembled with the effort. At the top, Takashi stood for a long moment, looking at the bell he had served for over 50 years, this object that had been both the center of his professional life and the source of the most profound spiritual experience he had ever known. He grasped the rope, feeling its familiar texture beneath his hands, and began the evening ringing. The pulls were harder now, his strength diminished by age, but the bell responded as it always had, producing that deep, resonant tone that seemed to contain all of time within its harmonics. 108 times he pulled and released, and when the final tone faded into silence, he stood with tears running down his face, overcome with gratitude for the life he had been given, for the opportunity to serve this temple and this bell, for having been present during those extraordinary days when the boundary between worlds had dissolved and spirits had spoken their truth to the living. "Thank you," he whispered to the bell. "Thank you for everything you have taught me." And in the silence that followed, Takashi could have sworn he heard, very faintly, like the last echo of a tone that had finished fading, a response. "The honor was ours who were allowed to speak through you, through your service, through your devotion. You have been a faithful guardian, and we are grateful." Whether he actually heard this or only imagined it, Takashi never tried to determine. It was enough to feel that the bell acknowledged him, that the connection between them was real and mutual, that his service had mattered not just in practical ways, but in spiritual dimensions he could barely comprehend. He descended from the bell tower for the last time, supported by Kenji, and retired to a small cottage on the temple grounds where he would live out his remaining years. He died 5 years later, peacefully in his sleep, and was buried in the temple cemetery with full honors. The monks rang the bell 108 times at his funeral, and many who attended swore they could hear, within the bell's voice, something that sounded like welcome, as if spirits on the other side were greeting one of their own, a man who had served the bridge between worlds with dedication and love. Part 8. The broader context. The events at Shorinji in March 1895 were extraordinary, but not entirely unique. Throughout Japanese history, there have been numerous documented accounts of supernatural phenomena occurring during times of great social upheaval or transition, particularly at temples and shrines, those liminal spaces where the boundary between mundane and sacred is already thin. These accounts reveal patterns that help contextualize what happened in Kyoto during that particular spring. First, there's the consistent association between massive social change and increased spiritual activity. The late 12th century, when the Heian period gave way to the Kamakura period and the first shogunate was established, saw numerous reports of supernatural occurrences. Temples reported bells ringing at odd hours. People claimed to see ghosts of fallen warriors, and there were accounts of mysterious lights and sounds that defied natural explanation. Similarly, the Sengoku period of the 15th and 16th centuries, when Japan was torn by constant warfare and the old feudal order was breaking down, produced countless stories of hauntings, possessions, and other supernatural events. It was during this period that many of Japan's most famous ghost stories originated, tales that were collected and written down by scholars and priests who recognized their cultural and spiritual significance. The connection between social upheaval and spiritual activity makes a certain kind of sense when viewed through the lens of traditional Japanese belief. If reality includes both material and spiritual dimensions, and if these dimensions are normally separated by a boundary or veil, then it stands to reason that this boundary might be affected by major disturbances in the human realm. When social structures collapse, when traditional ways of life are overturned, when large numbers of people die violent or untimely deaths, the resulting spiritual disruption might weaken or tear the veil, allowing traffic between worlds that would normally be impossible. The Meiji Restoration of 1868 was precisely this kind of cataclysmic change. Within a single generation, Japan transformed from a feudal society that had been isolated from the world for 2.5 centuries into a modern nation-state, racing to catch up with Western powers. The old class system was abolished. The samurai, who had dominated Japanese society for 700 years, were stripped of their privileges and often their livelihoods. Ancient traditions were questioned or discarded. Western ideas flooded in, challenging every assumption about how society should be organized. This transformation, while in many ways necessary and beneficial, was also traumatic for millions of people. Many older Japanese, particularly those from the former samurai class, felt that they no longer understood the world they lived in, that everything they had believed and valued had been declared obsolete overnight. Some adapted, some resisted. Many died feeling displaced and confused, uncertain what their lives had meant in the context of this new Japan that seemed to have no place for them or the world they represented. These are precisely the conditions that, according to traditional belief, would create restless spirits. People dying with strong emotions unresolved, with identities tied to a social order that no longer existed, with a desperate need to be remembered and honored in a world that seemed eager to forget them. The events of March 1895 can be understood as a manifestation of this spiritual unrest, with the spirits of multiple eras, not just the Meiji era, but reaching all the way back to the Heian period, drawn forth by Kyoto's Act of Remembrance, by the city's decision to honor its past through the construction of the Heian Shrine. But Shorinji was not the only temple where such phenomena occurred during the Meiji era. Research conducted by scholars of religion and folklore has uncovered numerous similar accounts from across Japan during the late 19th and early 20th centuries. At a temple in Sendai, monks reported that their bell would ring softly during the middle of the night, never loud enough to wake neighbors, but distinctly audible to anyone inside the temple compound. This continued for months, starting shortly after a nearby samurai estate was demolished to make way for a modern school building. In Nagasaki, at a temple that had served the city's hidden Christian community during the centuries when Christianity was banned, there were reports of mysterious lights appearing in the chapel, and visitors claimed to hear hymns sung in Latin by invisible voices. This occurred during the period when Christianity was being legalized and Japanese Christians were emerging from hiding, a time of profound transition for that community. At a Shinto shrine in Nara, priests reported that offerings of rice and sake would mysteriously rearrange themselves overnight, and there were consistent reports of seeing figures in ancient court dress walking the shrine grounds at dawn. Investigation revealed that the shrine stood on the site of an ancient palace that had been destroyed during one of the civil wars of the medieval period, and historians speculated that the spirits of courtiers who had died when the palace burned were manifesting during this time of national attention to Japan's imperial past. These accounts, when examined together, suggest that the events at Shorinji were part of a broader pattern of spiritual activity occurring across Japan as the country grappled with modernization. The pattern reveals several consistent elements. The phenomena typically occurred at sites with long histories and deep connections to the past. They intensified during periods when the present was actively engaging with history, either through commemoration or through the destruction of historical structures. They often involved sound, particularly bells, perhaps because sound carries across the boundary between worlds more easily than other forms of communication. And they generally ceased once some form of acknowledgement or resolution had been achieved, suggesting that the spirits involved had specific needs or messages that, once addressed, allowed them to return to rest. This pattern also appears in other cultures and historical periods, though the specific forms vary. In Europe during the Industrial Revolution, there were numerous reports of hauntings at sites where historical buildings were being demolished to make way for factories or modern housing. In China during the Cultural Revolution, when traditional practices were being actively suppressed and historical sites destroyed, there were reports, though suppressed by authorities, of supernatural phenomena at temples and ancestral halls. The universal thread running through all these accounts is the human need to maintain continuity with the past, to honor those who came before us, and to acknowledge that the dead have a kind of claim on the living, a right to be remembered and respected. When this need is thwarted, when change happens so rapidly that the past is simply discarded without ceremony or acknowledgement, something in the collective psyche rebels, and this rebellion can manifest in ways that transcend purely psychological explanations. Modern psychology would interpret these phenomena as projections, the collective unconscious expressing through hallucination and shared delusion the anxieties and guilts of a society undergoing traumatic change. There is likely truth in this interpretation, but it is not necessarily the whole truth. The consistent testimony of reliable witnesses, the physical manifestations like bells ringing without human agency, the detailed messages received that contain information unknown to those who receive them, all of this suggests that something more than pure psychology might be involved. Perhaps the most productive approach is not to choose between materialist and spiritual explanations, but to recognize that human consciousness and reality itself may be more complex than our current scientific paradigms account for. If consciousness is not entirely contained within individual brains, but has some collective or non-local aspects, if the past is not simply gone, but remains present in some dimension we don't normally perceive, if matter and spirit are not strictly separate categories, but exist on a continuum, then events like those at Shorinji become not violations of natural law, but manifestations of natural laws we don't yet fully understand. This perspective allows us to take seriously both the documented facts of what occurred and the traditional spiritual interpretations of those facts. The bell did ring without anyone pulling the rope. Multiple reliable witnesses confirmed this. Spirits were present, again, witnessed by multiple people over multiple nights. These spirits communicated a message about the importance of remembering and honoring the past. This message was heard and understood by those present. All of this can be accepted as factual without requiring us to abandon rational thought or scientific inquiry. It simply requires expanding our sense of what might be possible, acknowledging that the universe is stranger and more mysterious than our usual assumptions allow. The legacy of the Shorinji events extended beyond the immediate participants to influence how Japanese society thought about the relationship between tradition and modernity. The story was written about in newspapers and magazines, discussed in academic circles, and incorporated into the broader cultural conversation about Japan's identity in a changing world. Some intellectuals seized on the story as evidence that modernization was happening too quickly, that Japan was losing its soul in its rush to become westernized. They argued that the spirit's manifestation was a warning, a sign that the country needed to slow down, to be more careful about what traditions it abandoned, to ensure that change happened in ways that maintained continuity with the past. Others interpreted the events differently, seeing them not as a warning against change, but as an affirmation that change could be accomplished while still honoring tradition. The spirits in this interpretation were not protesting modernization, but simply asking to be remembered, asking that their contributions be acknowledged even as society moved forward. The resolution of the haunting, occurring after the Heian shrine dedication, suggested that proper commemoration was sufficient, that the dead did not require the living to abandon progress, only to remember where that progress came from. This second interpretation became increasingly influential as the Meiji era progressed and gave way to subsequent periods. Japan discovered that it could be both modern and Japanese, that it could adopt Western technologies and organizational methods while maintaining distinctively Japanese cultural practices and values. The country developed a model of modernization that was neither purely Western nor purely traditional, but something new, a synthesis that drew strength from both sources. The Shorinji story became, in a sense, a parable for this synthesis. Just as the temple had accommodated both its ancient bell with its centuries of history and the modern world surrounding it, just as the monks had honored tradition while living in the present, so too could Japan as a whole navigate between past and future, old and new, finding ways to preserve what was essential while adapting to changing circumstances. This model has continued to influence Japanese society into the present day. Contemporary Japan is arguably the most technologically advanced society on Earth. Yet maintains traditional practices and preserves historical sites with remarkable dedication. Temples and shrines stand alongside skyscrapers. Ancient festivals are celebrated with genuine enthusiasm in cities that epitomize modernity. Tea ceremony, flower arrangement, calligraphy, and other traditional arts continue to be practiced and valued. This is not mere nostalgia or tourist performance, but a living commitment to maintaining continuity with the past, a commitment that can be traced back, at least in part, to events like those at Shorinji in March 1895, when the past spoke directly to the present and was heard. And so our story comes to its end, though of course stories like this never truly end. They continue to resonate, to influence, to shape how people think and feel and understand their place in the world. The bell at Shorinji still rings twice daily, morning and evening, as it has for over 3 centuries. Its voice still carries across the hillside, still marks the passage of time, still serves as a bridge between the material and spiritual realms. The temple itself remains a small and relatively unknown place compared to Kyoto's famous landmarks, but cherished by those who know it, valued for the particular quality of peace and presence that seems to inhabit its grounds. Visitors still come seeking connection to the past, to their ancestors, to something deeper than the surface rush of modern life. And sometimes, on quiet evenings when the light slants golden through the pine trees and the air is very still, those visitors report feeling that they are not quite alone, that they're being watched over gently and kindly by presences they cannot see but can somehow sense. Whether these presences are actual spirits or projections of the visitor's own longings and needs, whether the events of March 1895 were genuine supernatural manifestations or elaborate shared hallucinations, perhaps matters less than what the story teaches us. We are not separate from our past. We are built upon it, connected to it, obligated to honor and remember it. The dead are not truly gone as long as we keep their memory alive, as long as we acknowledge their contributions, as long as we maintain the traditions and practices that connect us to them across the years and centuries. In our own time, as we face changes as profound and disorienting as those the Japanese faced during the Meiji era, perhaps we need to hear the message that the Spirit spoke through that ancient bell. Do not forget us. Do not leave us behind in your rush toward the future. Honor what we were, what we gave, what we dreamed. Hold us in your hearts and your memories, and we will hold you in return. This is not a call to resist change or to live in the past. It is an invitation to carry the past with us as we move forward, to let the wisdom of previous generations inform our choices, to maintain the continuity that gives life meaning and identity. Whether we think of this in spiritual terms, as honoring actual spirits who continue to exist in some afterlife realm, or in purely secular terms, as maintaining cultural memory and tradition, the practical effect is the same. We become more grounded, more connected, more capable of navigating change without losing ourselves in the process. The temple bells of Kyoto continue to ring, morning and evening, day after day, year after year, century after century. They mark time, but also transcend it. They exist in the present moment, but carry echoes of all the moments they have witnessed. They speak to the living, but also to the dead. They are instruments of metal and craft, but also doorways to mystery, reminders that reality is larger and stranger and more beautiful than our everyday awareness usually allows us to perceive. So tonight, as you drift towards sleep, perhaps you might imagine yourself in Kyoto on a spring evening, standing on a hillside temple ground as twilight deepens into darkness. You hear in the distance the sound of a bronze bell being struck, and that sound flows across the city like a wave, reaching you with its deep, complex tone. In that tone, you hear all the ringing that came before, all the monks who have stood in bell towers across the centuries, pulling ropes and releasing striking beams, creating sound that reaches across boundaries we cannot see. And perhaps in that sound, you hear voices, faint but distinct, speaking from times long past, reminding you that you are part of a chain that stretches back through countless generations and will continue forward through countless more. That you are never truly alone, that the past lives in you and through you, and that the simple act of remembering is itself a form of magic, a way of keeping the dead alive and drawing strength from their continued presence in our hearts and minds. Sleep well, dear listeners. Dream of bells and spirits, of temples and cherry blossoms, of a city where past and present dance together in eternal conversation. And when you wake, remember, honor the past, embrace the present, and trust that the future will unfold as it should, guided by the wisdom of all who came before and the courage of all who will come after. Thank you for joining me on this journey into the world of the mysterious and the inexplicable. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to subscribe to Mystic Sleep Tales and turn on notifications so you don't miss any episodes. Let's meet in the comments. Where are you listening from, and what time is it there right now? Are you falling asleep in California as dawn breaks over Tokyo? Are you listening while someone else is commuting to work in London or having lunch in Sydney? It's wonderful to know that through these stories we are all connected, sharing these moments of wonder and wonder despite being scattered across the globe. And please, share with me any mysteries or stories you'd like to see covered in future episodes. Are there any particular historical events that fascinate you? Legends from your own culture that deserve to be shared? Unexplained events that intrigue you? Until next time, sleep peacefully, dream vivid dreams, and remember that the world is often far stranger and more wonderful than we allow ourselves to believe. Remember that tomorrow is the first day of the rest of your life. Good night.